moving right along, we left off looking at the alliance, the first triumvirate, which itself undermined Republican Rome. We're seeing a lot of things that are weakening and showing and putting more cracks into the armor of the Republican system. And the next stage sort of brings it to completion. Julius Caesar got himself appointed to fight Roman enemies and conquer Gaul. Gaul was present-day France, so this was not too far, just over the Alps from Italy. And in the map you can see all the places that Caesar fought major engagements against one Gallic tribe or another. The Gauls were not united as one. There were some attempts to do so, but part of Rome's and Caesar's success here in conquering Gaul, this was a successful campaign over about an 8-year period, is because they weren't totally united. But it's also partly because the Romans, as we know, were formidable in their military prowess, both in organization, fighting strategy and tactics, and because Caesar himself was a gifted general who revolutionized warfare in certain ways too that we don't need to go into. And at the same time turned himself into a very popular hero, which remember was one of his goals because he was the ultimate popularis. So the public couldn't wait to hear news of yet another battlefield victory from their conquering hero, literally Julius Caesar. And he's playing this up to his own advantage. So the Roman Senate was much more ambivalent about all of this. The major leaders of Rome back home, when they got news of yet another victory by Julius Caesar and his armies, his legions in Gaul, they love the fact that he's winning battles, that's increasing Roman power against an enemy, but they also understand that every victory that Caesar has, one after another, makes him more powerful and makes him more popular. And they already saw the possibility that he might try to take over. The first triumvirate was going to be the first sign, but now with this kind of success and powerful armies behind him, he might just make a march on Rome and a power play. And sure enough, that's exactly what he did. He crossed the Rubicon in 49, I believe, BCE. A little tiny river, like a stream. I don't know if it exists today. So the river itself wasn't much, but the phrase crossing the Rubicon has now entered our lexicon today. And when you cross the Rubicon, if you haven't heard this already, you will at some point. It means that you make a decision. There's no going back. Once you've crossed the Rubicon, you can't go back. It's too late. And so when Caesar crossed the Rubicon, which wasn't literally, right? I mean, it wasn't literally that once he crossed that stream or river that he couldn't go back. It's a symbol because he made a decision right there in that place and had to make a decision to either march on Rome with his armies and try to take control of Rome itself, meaning destroy the empire or the republic and make yourself into a dictator or whatever else you might call yourself, or do I hold off on doing that and stick within the law because I was sent out here to win military victories for Rome, as kind of an employee of Rome, not to be the conqueror of Rome itself. So when he made the decision to march on Rome with hostile intent, then he had crossed the Rubicon. There was no returning because now he's seen as an outlaw, at least by the Senate, by the Republican institutions and leaders, as a rebel. But the rebel wasn't to be stopped because he did have the power. So he did make his way into Rome almost unopposed. Any leaders that had ability as generals that might have been able to put up resistance evaporated, and many of them fled. Caesar saw to it that many of them were hunted down and defeated anyway, so they wouldn't come back and challenge his rule. And he installed himself as a dictator for a number of years. But he made himself increasingly unpopular within the senatorial ranks because he acted as a dictator and was turning Rome into one. I mean, the very fact that he marched on Rome with a hostile army in the first place, already made the Senate hostile. But there was nothing they could do about it because he had the army and the public behind him. So what they did do about it, finally, on the Ides of March, as it's known, they planned and carried out an assassination. A number of senators themselves actually carrying daggers underneath their robes in the Senate chamber, stabbing Caesar many, many times to death. And I put at the bottom, this is us talking to Caesar today. You didn't see this coming? Because we certainly did. How did he not see that he was hated so much? There was a good chance that someone was going to try to take him out. He apparently, this painting isn't exactly accurate. He was apparently sitting at a table signing like legislation as dictator and carrying on day-to-day government when this happens. Like, you're sitting at a table, there's people around you, behind you, beside you, you're putting yourself in a vulnerable position. Nonetheless, the reasons why he would have put himself in that position, much of it I think is psychological, and it's interesting to speculate on, though we can never know for sure, but we're not going to for reasons of time. Brutus and Cassius, two of the conspirators, ended up having to hightail it out of Rome because after this was done, Caesar had lots of allies, lots of subordinates who now wanted Brutus and Cassius and the other co-conspirators and murderers, plotters, dead. So things get even more dramatic and more intense, and enter Octavian stage right now. Octavian, a young and ruthless aristocrat, Caesar's grandnephew, an adoptive son, and he was like 18 years old or something, looked, I think, younger than that, and he was kind of this, prodigy, a guy who's super, super smart. Caesar had already sort of been training him to be a political and military leader, but nobody took him really seriously, partly because of his youth, partly because he was kind of frail and somewhat sickly, so he didn't look like much that could get in your way. Although, of course, we know looks can be deceiving. He didn't have a great deal of courage on the battlefield, to put it mildly, but he was utterly cold-blooded when it came to political decisions and having people assassinated that were on the wrong side of him. So he got underestimated big time here. But Octavian, for a time, teamed up with Caesar's most famous and most trusted subordinate general and leader, another famous guy, Mark Antony. And so Antony and Octavian, and I'm simplifying, there are some other figures in here, got their loyal troops together. Remember, there's lots of private armies now, and a number of legions just swear an oath of loyalty immediately to Octavian once Caesar's killed, simply because of the namesake. He's Caesar's adoptive son and blood relative, so they say, we'll follow you. Mark Antony got many of the legions that had been under Caesar's command to follow him because they knew him, and they knew he was a gifted and courageous and loyal leader himself. But so Antony and Octavian went after Cassius and Brutus, who also had military forces with them, and chased them around the Mediterranean. Most of the battles took place outside of Rome and outside of Italy, and finally did vanquish them. But the alliance between Antony and Octavian was not easy and not smooth from the beginning. Antony did underestimate the kid, and Antony was courageous, tough, brave, loyal, but was, I think, intellectually no match for Octavian, and I don't think he realized it until it was too late. Even while they were allies fighting against Caesar's murderers, Octavian was already spreading, planning, creating propaganda, or having it created to make Antony look bad. So getting all kinds of bad publicity, and probably wondering where it was coming from. Where am I getting these sort of, the the press, people and making statements in the forum, bad mouthing me, or making up these lies. Well, it was coming from Octavian, and he didn't know. So Octavian was always setting things up to move Antony out of the way. So sure enough, after the murderers of Caesar were defeated, if you thought everything was finally good now, things returned back to normal, take another guess, because as you've probably now predicted, Octavian and Antony square off now, and the winner is going to be the ruler of Rome. And at the Battle of Actium, a naval battle, primarily, Octavian's forces, though he didn't do much to, ensure or be involved in the actual fighting itself, but his forces won over Antony's. And Antony famously took off with his lover, Cleopatra, also famous, and they committed suicide together later after they knew they were done in Rome, because Octavian had bested them politically and militarily, in terms of propaganda, across the board. I'm not feeling so well because Octavian had the habit of, on the days of battles, sort of not showing up, letting his forces fight. I'll join you tomorrow. I've got a kind of a cold here or whatever. So this is why he's often considered not to be the most courageous of leaders. So this ushers in the Roman Empire. We went through it fairly quickly, but we've seen the Republican institutions decay and collapse through many events, and the crowning blow really was Caesar marching in hostile fashion on Rome, taking over the Republic, turning into a dictatorship. But it didn't become an empire until his adoptive son and grandnephew Octavian took the reins of power in his hands, and that's the moment at which historians believe that Rome became effectively an empire. Though Octavian, who now gets renamed by the Senate Augustus, never calls himself the Emperor of Rome, but all historians think of him as the first Emperor of Rome. And Augustus is one of the greatest political leaders in Roman history. I don't necessarily mean good in terms of morally good, but greatest in terms of ability, and his ability to using his ability to increase Rome's power in the world. Norman Cantor says, when the Roman Empire reached its fullest extent around 100 AD, it stretched from London to Jerusalem, from Vienna to Tunis, North Africa. It was another 400 years before this peerless imperial structure cracked and disintegrated. Remember, I said earlier that most historians believe that the Republic as a form of government, as Rome's empire grew, its sort of responsibility, or its ability to control, govern this vast empire composed of lots of different ethnic, cultural, religious groups, was too difficult to do for a republican system of government. It required a more top-down, leadership, dictator, king, emperor that could snap his fingers and make things happen. And that may have been true, and so if that's the case, then it fits in that sense, though that's not, I think, necessarily why Octavian did what he did. I'm sure he thought he was the best leader for Rome, but he was incredibly ambitious, and so part of this is about his ambition and successful drive for power, as it came to be. There were three makeovers of the empire, really. The first one is just the fact that it became an empire in the first place, but Augustus was quite clever with all this, as we'll see. The second makeover came at the height of Roman power. It's called the Pax Romana, Roman peace, where Rome had really subdued most of its enemies within the Roman Empire and outside, at least for the time. And so this became kind of the golden age of Rome. artistically, creatively, as well as politically, and in every other way. But a guy named Hadrian comes along in the middle of the Pax Romana, one of the emperors, number of emperors later after Augustus, and he believed that Rome had overextended itself. Empires often suffer from sort of an overextension problem, imperial overreach or overstretch. And Hadrian believed this, traveled a lot throughout the empire, sometimes called the traveling emperor, and decided we have to stop taking territory. What we better do instead is start building more defenses and defend what we have more effectively rather than keep trying to conquer more. We already have enough or too much. The third makeover is when the empire started to show signs of cracking, maybe even on the road to collapse, empire crumbling, and two emperors back-to-back, their reigns back-to-back, that is, Diocletian and the famous Constantine, imposed a set of really draconian and radical reforms to try to patch up the cracks in the Roman imperial system. Interpretations of the empire. I started with Tacitus's quote, "To make a desert and call it peace." As a Roman himself, surprisingly, right, he was willing to criticize his own government and say that the Romans, we can be brutal, and we have been. Centuries later, in the 18th century, Edward Gibbon, a British historian, wrote the classic work, The Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, in which he believed that the first 2 centuries of the Roman Empire, kind of from Augustus for the next 2 centuries on, was the happiest time in human history. And so this is just one way to get at the question of, did the Romans do anything positive? For themselves, besides for themselves, did they? Are they a plus in world history, or are they? Did they just do damage in history? So there's differing opinion on this. Of course, today it's the majority of historians by far believe that the Romans did more harm than they did good, but it's still open to debate and still is debated to some degree. And I do think there is some truth to the modern interpretation that we see at the bottom that comes from Monty Python. Some of you may not know Monty Python. Makes me seem or feel very old, which I am. But I always have a few Monty Python enthusiasts in my courses. But there's a scene, right? That's a comedy group, and they did some movies too. There's a scene in one of their movies called Life of Brian, which is about the Roman Empire, the relationship between the Hebrews, Jews, conquered province under the control of the Romans. But it's comedy. But sometimes the best comedy sometimes does really good political, social satire, and they do here. In one scene, there's a secret meeting of this revolutionary Jewish group who's sort of plotting against the Romans and trying to, oust them from Palestine. So kind of a underground, group of rebels, revolutionaries, and they're holding this meeting. And John Cleese, kind of the main Monty Python guy, sitting up at this head table on this meeting in this dumpy kind of dark room with people sitting in the audience, I don't know, like 50 of them or so, and he starts saying rhetorically, "What have the Romans ever done for us?" Sort of pounding his fist on the table. What have they ever done for us? And it's rhetorical because the obvious answer is supposed to be nothing, right? Nothing good. And finally, sort of a hand goes up somewhat meekly in the middle or the back, and someone says the aqueduct, and he says, okay, all right, so you're right, the aqueduct. But other than the aqueduct, what have the Romans ever done for us? And then another hand goes up, law. Okay, the aqueduct and law, and it just keeps going on and on and on and on. And it's uproariously funny, though it doesn't sound so by the way I said it. But there's a point to that. people love to, and they're right to, in many ways, complain about what empires do to subject peoples, because the history of empire is brutal and bloody, and the Romans were certainly brutal and bloody and cruel. The Romans weren't known for placing a high value on human life. So there's a great deal to criticize, and we should, but that doesn't mean there weren't some benefits as well, and that weighing the cost and benefits might be sometimes necessary. Because when the Romans finally did get driven out, or the collapse as an empire, and peoples got their independence that had once been ruled by the Romans as part of the empire, sometimes the Romans left behind law. The aqueducts are still there, and running water because of that is still there, and there was something to be said for whether the Romans had intended to really help them or not. Some of it may have been unintended, some of it intended. But you can make a case that there were quite a few benefits. So what have the Romans done for us? Well, yeah, they were brutal and came in and conquered us by force, which is never pleasant, and no one's ever going to support that if you're on the other side of it. But they did do some things for us, whoever us was, in one case or the other. Augustus, as sort of part of makeover number one, he knew, this guy was a shrewd political operator, he knew that the people of Rome and the Roman Empire were used to their republican institutions, expected there to be republican institutions, would be, full of anxiety and anger and fear if the republican institutions had gone away, which they already had, but ever more reason for him to feel the need, as he did, to maintain the appearance of a republic, while in reality, behind the scenes, sort of switching over and creating the foundations of a different type of top-down government, an empire with an emperor at the top. But he wasn't subtle in every way, had a lot of his enemies murdered once achieving power, although he did it sort of as quietly as you can. He gave the Senate a lot of busy work to do. So here's one of the ways he maintained the appearance of republican institutions are still working and functioning as ever, and in a healthy way. So the citizens would think, right, that this is just a new leader of the republic. It's still the same institutions, but he was just sort of making it look like the Senate was doing things with some truth. Then he could claim that he ruled in partnership with the Senate, giving them things to study and come back and make reports and do commissions and this kind of thing. But it was really all for show. He pushed through morals legislation, which he may have really believed in, probably did. By this time, for sure, not before, the Roman elites, the patrician class, was known for its decadence, which has been, I think, somewhat overrated in the movies and played up. But it was somewhat true that the rich people lived this lavish lifestyle, and they were quite decadent and debauched at times. So Augustus appears to have passed this legislation, series of laws that crack down on sort of illicit things and vices of various types. Maybe partly because he believed in them, but certainly also because, as a shrewd politician, and that he was, he understood this would play well with the public. Right, the average, person, poor, just average Joe, most likely hated the patrician class, and so he'd see it as, my guy Augustus is sticking it to these rich fat cats with his morals legislation. I love it. So this was, I think, carefully crafted to bring popularity from the public to Augustus. So he introduced the practice of emperor worship abroad. In Italy, there was only a worship of the emperor's spirit of leadership, because remember, he didn't rule as a self-proclaimed emperor. He called himself the first citizen, or princeps in Latin. So I'm not the emperor, I'm just the first citizen. Yeah, I'm the first citizen, but I'm still just a citizen, just like you. Right? So he made it look like he wasn't sort of all-powerful. He actually retired after winning the Battle of Actium and having power to himself. But it was all set up. After he retired, as soon as he did, the Senate begged him to come back to office and to rule and lead the empire. And so he made it look like, I don't really want to. I'm not that ambitious. I'm not an emperor. I just served Rome. I avenged my adoptive father's assassination, and now I just want to kind of retire to my own private life. And oh, what? You guys need me to be in power? Oh, okay, I'll do it. So he made it look reluctant, so that it would again veil his keen, huge, driving ambition to rule with an iron fist over Rome. And so this really was a profound political revolution, because in many ways the Republic was already dead, but it didn't have anything in its place, and it might have been possible to revive it had somebody had the will. But Augustus had the power, and he didn't want to revive it. Once again, Tacitus, the historian, comes a little bit after Augustus, but writes about him, said the country had been transformed. Political equality was a thing of the past. All eyes now watched for imperial commands. So the Republican institutions and people living in Republican Rome were used to some semblance of political equality, and now they have to quickly get used to, if they don't, they're going to have to accept it anyway, the emperor making commands from on high. Augustus Caesar, again, the former Octavian, same guy, got a name change. He let the Senate call him Blessed One, which is what Augustus means. And he started to become known as the savior of all mankind, which was also propaganda on his part. But he was a creative statesman and gifted at knowing how to wield and manipulate political power. Again, that doesn't necessarily say that he was a nice guy. As Chester Starr says, and I would agree, that he was the most brilliant politician of antiquity in the ancient world. Although Starr only means in the ancient West. Historians don't usually compare, say, leaders in Rome to leaders in China from that long ago, because they really weren't in contact. So it's hard to compare them. But he probably was the greatest politician of his day, or in any day in the ancient world, in the Mediterranean and European world. So he was full of remarkable achievements, and it's hard to argue with stability, prosperity, and success. So over time, some Roman citizens who had at first maybe lamented to the degree that they knew the collapse of Republican institutions and Republican government came to probably favor it once they saw that Augustus had taken away rights, taken away public participation in government, but he had brought back stability, prosperity, success. Right? And with all those years of civil war and all the crazy roller coaster ride, better than fiction, civil wars and slave rebellions and foreign wars and intrigue and contests for power between one private army and one private leader after another, that they're probably, I'll take a guy that just brings law and order, and I'm safe to go outside without getting cut down in the crossfire between two rival military leaders. I'll just take the law and order and stability, and forget anything like equality. I'm happy to be in this system that's got things under control again. He did understand then how to maintain a facade of Republican institutions while camouflaging his successful turning of the state of Roman institutions into absolute power. So this is the transition period, but he pulled it off rather flawlessly. And he retired, as I said before, and came back under the circumstances I already mentioned. He did have some sense of civic duty, reformed the army. He did away with the private armies. That was not just about civic duty, but about practicality. He clearly understood that private armies are bad for the government, and now he's the government, the head of government, for as long as he wants it. But if he allows generals to have private armies, he has potential challenges on his hands that could cause his ouster and even assassination. So he paid his soldiers and armies well. His officers retired them with land so that they would fight for Rome and not for and fight willingly for Rome and not just for some guy. That's one of the ways that individuals like Marius and Sulla had gotten their soldiers and officers to be loyal to them first, as they paid them personally. Said, hey, you fight for me and not just Rome. Make your main loyalty to me and not the Roman Republic, and I'll give you a big chunk of land when you retire. So he's now having the government do that so that they're not tempted by money to be loyal to somebody other than the government. He helped to restore the Romans' public pride that had been fading because of all the problems during the latter years of the Republic. As part of his reforms, part of this sense of civic duty, restoring public pride, he had more aqueducts built, created a fire brigade, a police force, gave out free grain to the poorest of the poor, homeless, funded entertainments, improved the legal system, fought corruption, allowed for the first time provincials, meaning someone living outside of Italy but part of the empire, say in North Africa or Palestine. He allowed them now to sue Roman officials in court. So that's actually quite a list of reforms that were legitimate, though he held the power in his hands. So he was at least a responsible, emperor, which we can't say up and down throughout Roman imperial history. In fact, just after Augustus dies of old age, we start to see problems quickly. And this brings us to the ups and downs of the GiulioClaudian dynasty, which really means the relatives of Augustus and Caesar himself. And the first four emperors after Augustus were sort of a mixed bag. Two of them were good leaders, Tiberius, who succeeded Augustus, and a little bit later Claudius. You see pictured in a movie here anyway on the right, and two fanatical and probably insane leaders, Caligula and Nero. The former I have pictured here. Professor Perry says, although their regimes were marked by conspiracies, summary executions, and assassinations, the great achievements of Augustus were preserved and strengthened. So somehow Rome made it through this period where the leadership was very inconsistent. Caligula and Nero Caligula was a spoiled brat, young guy that came from this rich and powerful family, and was obnoxious and maybe homicidal. And so Rome was lucky to get through this period. Caligula is this stuff could all be myth, but he's said to have made a horse consul. And Nero is this is a more famous story. It's been said that when the Great Fire broke out, 70 I forget what year it was, AD, but a fire in Rome burned much of Rome down, and he apparently fiddled the entire time, fiddle like a violin. So he's the emperor, and the place is burning down, and he's just sort of in his own little world, apparently not caring. So as all this evidence of weaknesses in Augustus' system, in some ways, yes, because if you put all the power in the hands of one guy, he better be damn good at what he does, or you're in trouble. But after that period of instability, the Romans got lucky and got a series of several good emperors in a row. Hence the creative phrase "good emperors," as they're known collectively, and they ruled during the time that's known to historians as the Romans called themselves, historians called the Pax Romana, Roman peace. So a long period of about 200 years where there were very few wars, partly because the Romans had sort of subdued and bludgeoned everybody else into submission. Cantor says the Roman Empire of 150 AD was a glorious thing, to be long remembered as a golden age. Literature and philosophy flourished. A legal system was in place which became the basis of the legal system of all but England's. And beauty of Roman cities still command great respect and frequent imitation, and on and on and on. So this is, I mentioned before, the kind of high point, the golden age of Rome. And really kind of from Augustus's time forward, you see a lot of cultural achievements where philosophers, remember the Romans weren't known for philosophy, but they had sort of their best ones sort of right in this period, art, etc., etc. Writers. Now we get to the next makeover that I already mentioned. So Hadrian comes along in the middle of the Pax Romana, one of the good emperors, and thinks we've pushed out to the limits. We have to shore up what we already have. We need to defend the empire better and more effectively, and spend more of our time, energy, and resources and effort doing that than conquering more territory. Chester Starr, writing of all the emperors of the period, the most remarkable figure was Hadrian. He seemed to have, I think, a keen strategic awareness of Rome's situation. So he did slow them down and shore up the defenses. And this is nice and symmetrical, easy to remember, but the perfect symbol of Hadrian's own tendency and putting into place policies of defense more than offense is what you see in the picture in the right here, which is Hadrian's Wall, which still stands, a modern photograph, as you can see. But Hadrian's Wall kind of divides Scotland from England, because on the other side of that wall was non-Roman territory, and on this side of the wall is Roman territory. So what better symbol of defense, being the emphasis, than a wall? And the wall got named after him. So Hadrian's Wall is an easy way to remember that Hadrian was the guy that came in and just said we have to defend and not invade so much anymore. The